In the year 1044, as the winter chill of Yuletide spread across the north, King Magnus of Norway unleashed fire and destruction upon Denmark. Thralls fled the burning halls of their fallen masters, while men were killed before their families, and their wives and children were taken as spoils of war. The invaders were in search of the rebellious Jarl Sven, whom the Danes had crowned as their king to replace the foreign rule of King Magnus. After the deaths of Canute the Great and his son, King Magnus had inherited a claim to the thrones of both England and Denmark. While he refrained from pursuing the English crown, his dominion over Denmark was now sealed by bloodshed and destruction. The warriors of Spain lay scattered across the land, some drifting lifeless in the cold tide, others hiding in the darkened forests. Spain had taken refuge at the court of the King of Sweden, and Magnus the Good was hailed as the rightful and noble ruler of Norway and Denmark. Tales of miracles surrounded his late father, the devout Christian King Olaf, now venerated as a saint. Magnus' armies were vast, and his claim to the throne so sacred that it seemed no one in the land could challenge his rule. But from across the seas, a storm blew in, heralding the arrival of a stranger's ship. This was the bane of kings, a Viking once exiled from these shores, Magnus' uncle and Saint Olaf's brother. He was Harald Sigurdsson, a mercenary returned to claim the crown of Norway. For years, he had lived in exile at the Swedish court, where he had accumulated immense wealth and strange treasures. It had been nearly 15 years since he fled Scandinavia, from the battlefield where his brother Olaf fell. And in that time, he had earned glory and riches as a hired champion in the lands of the Rus and the Byzantine Empire. That autumn, as Magnus and his men sailed along the coasts, they were struck by the sight of Harald's magnificent ship. King Magnus greeted his uncle with cautious hospitality. Harald had recently secured a powerful alliance by marrying the fair Elisaveta, daughter of the Grand Prince of Kiev, making him wealthier than King Magnus and positioning him with both a noble wife and a legitimate blood claim to the throne. Harald then asked Magnus how he wished to share the rule of Norway between them. Magnus, however, replied that he needed to consult with his advisors first. His chief advisor, the elderly and longtime adversary of Olaf, Einar Thumberstjalfur, stepped forward and rebuked Harald. "We will not be divided between two kings," he declared. "We have always served one king, and so it must remain for as long as King Magnus reigns." Embarrassed, Harald returned to Sweden in shame. If his enemies would not accept him as king, Harald would make them accept him as a warrior. Dragon ships landed upon the shores, and the Northmen surged across the land at the command of Sven and Harald. The two men had sworn an oath of loyalty to each other, united in their ambition to conquer Denmark for Sven and Norway for Harald. Towns were reduced to burning ruins, men were slaughtered, and wailing women were ripped from their homes. It was said that few survived to tell the tale, for the land was drowned in sorrow and blood. The only captives taken in the battle were beautiful maidens, roughly herded down to the shores, where they were driven toward the ships. Their fair-haired heads bowed in terror, their soft skin scarred by the cruel iron shackles. News of the war reached Magnus, and his council advised against confronting Harald directly. Thus, secret messengers were dispatched between Magnus and Harald to negotiate a shared rule of Norway. Sven, suspicious of the negotiations, tried to assassinate Harald in his sleep. However, Harald narrowly escaped. Ultimately, Harald was crowned King Harald III of Norway. As co-ruler, Magnus insisted on retaining the title of primary king, claiming precedence in court matters and ceremonies. Magnus was adored by his people for his generosity and leniency, but Harald, viewing these traits as signs of weakness, came to despise him as soft and childish. The two men exchanged insults freely, but a greater threat united them. They joined forces to confront Sven in Denmark. In the fall of 1047, however, Magnus fell ill. As his strength waned, he declared that the sole rule of Norway should pass to Harald, while Denmark would be handed over to Sven. King Magnus the Good died soon after. Harald, however, did not feel bound by the wishes of a dying king. Without delay, He began preparations to march against Sven and claim Denmark for himself. But in the king's assembly, Einar boldly declared that he would return to Norway to bury Magnus. He proclaimed that he would rather serve Magnus in death than any other living king. The fighting men loyal to the chieftain Einar were so numerous and his influence so great that Harald had little choice but to tolerate such treasonous speech and return to assert his rule over Norway. For the high thrones of Scandinavia had not entirely supplanted the power of the Viking halls. Kings were still obliged to reckon with the old war clans of every region. Sven was raised as the king of the Danes, and when Harald went to ravage Denmark in the summer, Sven eluded capture. Harald returned to Norway and married a second wife, Thora of the influential Arnesen family. While his wives would bear him children to be raised as heirs to Norway, the king's gaze turned ever south. In 1050, he returned to terrorize Denmark. His Vikings tore over farmland, ruined villages, and burned churches. They tortured people to death, violated women, and burned the trading posts of Hedeby. When Spain at last met Harald with a massive army, Harald fled. In Norway, Harald moved to punish and assassinate those who questioned his rule. Yet Einar stood at the head of a mighty faction of chieftains who freely decried the king's butchery. At length, Harald requested a meeting with Einar to resolve the matter. Einar stepped alone into the king's chamber and remarked how dark the room was. A few of Harald's men then emerged from the shadows and killed him. Einar's son rushed in to the aid of his father, and they killed him too. The people came to despise King Harald, and there was wide talk of rebellion among the farmers. The king tasked his ally Finn Arnesen to entreat them to peace. Finn requested the king offer something in exchange for so dangerous a quest, the safe return of his brother Kulf. Kulf Arnesen was the greatest traitor to Harald's house. He was said to have personally killed Olaf. When Magnus learned of this crime years ago, Kulf fled into exile to the Norwegian domains along the northern edge of Scotland. Harald now welcomed Kulf back to Norway and restored him to his old estates. Then in the summer, King Harald went on campaign in Denmark and demanded that Kulf make the first assault against the Danish position. Only after Kulf was overrun and killed with his men did Harald land with reinforcements. Finn and all the people saw plainly the treachery of their vengeful king. Harald wrote that he took pride in having given the death stroke to two more of his enemies. The king burned and pillaged regions whose fealty wavered, and there were rumors that he stole offerings set by the faithful at the tomb of Saint Olaf. Though he raised great churches and the kingdom outwardly prospered, the people in coming centuries would know him as Hardrada, the hard ruler. For years he shed the blood of so many foes, but still the hated Sven of Denmark remained. Harald commanded 150 longships south, plundering shores which in those days belonged to the Danes. Then near the mouth of the river Nissa, the men were taken by the sight of a fleet twice their size. Spain had come to answer the king's challenge to war. In this land, the late summer sun lingers in the sky far into the evening, and even in the darkest hour, the embers of twilight burn brightly on the horizon. Amid this shadowy haze, Harald stirred his men to battle. The fleets were bound together by ropes and chains, holding their lines firm, as arrows and spears flew into shields, chests, and heads. Untethered Norwegian ships outflanked the Danes, and a brutal slaughter ensued on the decks. The Danes, overwhelmed, threw themselves into the sea, and Harald seized 70 of their ships. In the bloodied waters, his warriors captured a live Finn Arnesen, who had betrayed Harald to fight for Sven. Despite this, Harald chose to spare him. Meanwhile, King Sven had escaped the battle and regrouped. After years of brutal conflict, both kingdoms were ravaged by war, and within 2 years, Harald brokered an unconditional peace with Sven. Harald would remain in Norway, content to subjugate and destroy rebellious regions. Through bloodshed and fear, Harald secured peace in his kingdom. In his quieter moments, he would compose poetry, contemplating his own legacy. He may have heard tales of the Norsemen who had reached North America decades earlier. Having traveled far south as a mercenary, he now ventured north into glacial seas, beyond the known world. These realms were thought to be home to wild beasts and ancient monsters. Of his voyages, it was said that the king finally turned back when the very edge of the world vanished into a fog, and he narrowly escaped a gaping abyss. Harald had lived 50 winters, and the days of glorious and terrible war now seemed like distant memories to the aging king. But one day, a traveler arrived at his court. He was Tostig Godwin's son, or an envoy on his behalf. Tostig had until recently ruled in the Kingdom of England as the Earl of Northumbria, but he had been a harsh ruler, and when the people rebelled against him, his rival brother Harald Godwin's son succeeded in having him banished. And upon the death of the childless King Edward, the English High Council crowned Harald Godwin's son the King of England. The jealous brother, Tostig, sought retribution, imploring Harald of Norway to conquer the country, to redeem Magnus' old claim to the English throne. Harald Hardrada could become the Viking king of England, and Tostig would regain land and power as his vassal. So Harald prepared an army. In dreams, dark omens came to the king of Norway and his followers. One man saw a great battle in England, and before him a witch riding a wolf. With bloody jaws her beast devoured the carcasses of Harald's men, and she sang. The troll woman sees clearly the doom awaiting Harald. Grassy cliffs pulled high and quiet over the sea, and sloped into little dwellings where people beheld a scowling fleet bearing an army of around 10,000 warriors. Harald and his Vikings, betrothed by Tostig and some of his allies. Towns fell easily to the invaders, but when they reached the village of Skartaborg, the locals resisted. In response, the Vikings set fire to their houses and slaughtered the people. The raiders then pushed further inland by river, away from the watchful eyes of King Harald Godwin's son, who remained in the south with his army, anticipating an invasion from another claimant to the English throne, William, Duke of Normandy. The Normans, descendants of Viking raiders themselves, had long ago settled along the French coast, blending with the native Franks and adopting much of their culture. For the moment, Harald faced little opposition as his army advanced toward the great city of York. Its ancient walls and towers, weathered by time, were remnants of a past era when the land had belonged to the mighty legions of Rome. The English, however, would no longer hide behind those walls. On September 20th, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria led their armies against the Viking horde near the marshlands. The invaders pummeled them wildly, and the corpses of Englishmen were scattered about the wet grass. Survivors fled. York and the whole of Northumbria resolved to surrender. The nobles would be spared violence, but made to guarantee their loyalty by offering their children to be held as hostages by the Vikings. And so on September 25th, Harald took 2/3 of his army, and leaving their mail armor behind due to the hot weather, they marched to the site chosen for the exchange of hostages, Stamford Bridge. A cloud of dust appeared in the distance. Having trekked 200 miles in 4 or 5 days, here was King Harald Godwin's son in a great English army. Harald of Norway sent riders to call the final third of his army, stationed over an hour's ride away. Meanwhile, the English advanced onto the bridge. English chronicles would later recount that when the Viking lines began to falter, one warrior stood alone on the bridge, holding back the English for some time. He killed dozens of his foes before he was finally overwhelmed. Farther behind, Hardrada rode in front of his army, shouting that though his men lacked armor, their hearts were fearless. The Vikings formed a tight shield wall, spears planted forward, archers ready. The English cavalry charged, but the Viking shield wall held firm, repelling the assault. The English infantry then struck at the edges of the formation, but the Viking line did not break. After a fierce struggle, the English were forced to retreat. As the Vikings surged forward in pursuit, the English turned and rushed to fill the gaps in their broken ranks. In this bloodied swelter, hewn limbs and heads piled underfoot and dying screams rang out. Harald of Norway took up his rageful sword and slashed at his foes. It was said, neither helmet nor armor could withstand him, and all who were nearest gave way before him. And then an arrow struck through his throat, and King Harald Sigurdsson fell dead. His men did not surrender. Of them it was written the gallant men who saw him fall would take no quarter one, and all resolved to die with their loved king around his corpse in a corpse ring. The late arrival of reinforcements did not shift the tide of battle. Tostig was found dead with an arrow through his eye, and only a handful of ships loaded with shaken survivors would make the journey home to Norway. The English tended to their wounds and gathered the dead. It seemed King Harald Godwinson had saved England. Yet 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William, Duke of Normandy, invaded with thousands of mighty warriors. The king hastened south with some of his army, and at the Battle of Hastings, the Normans vanquished the weary English. Harald Godwinson was killed, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings. William would cast out the old aristocracy, massacre rebels, and put himself on the throne. Now came the days of a new line of kings, a new age in England. The power of the crown was strengthened. Warfare would change as hundreds of grand castles rarely seen before in this land were raised. England would grow closer to continental Europe and more close to the depredations of Scandinavia. Spain would twice attempt Danish invasions of England and fail. The body of King Harald Hardrada was returned to Norway, and the throne passed to his sons. He would be remembered in song and saga as both cruel and avaricious, yet adventurous, wise, and valiant. The last echo of a dark, brave, and wild age.